Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I am a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. And I'm thrilled to be here for the Raisina 2025 Ideas Pod. This is the 10th iteration of the Raisina Dialogue here in New Delhi, and we're thrilled to be here today to talk to two experts, high-level experts, about one of the most important issues in the foreign policy landscape today. Today we're going to be discussing the need to invest in liberal fleets. This session will examine the geopolitical implications of China's dominance in shipping and maritime infrastructure, and we're going to explore for 15 or 20 minutes just how global trade dynamics are shifting and what policies might be necessary to ensure a more diversified and secure maritime future. And again, we have two perfect experts to have this discussion with us today. To my immediate right is Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is a member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister here in India. So thank you, sir, for being with us today. We also have Mr. Brent Sadler, who is a senior research fellow with the Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology Allison Center for National Security, the Heritage Foundation, sorry, that's a long title, based in Washington, D.C. So thank you both for being with us today. I'm excited to jump into it. Brent, I want to start with you. You know, we have a new administration in the U.S. It's very much focused on China and the Indo-Pacific. We have a new shipbuilding office in the White House, which I think we haven't had that before in the United States. You know, we talk about the political implication of Chinese maritime dominance, but can you explain a little bit how we're seeing that play out? And what does this actually look like on the global stage? What steps is China taking to really take control of shipping and maritime infrastructure?
Well, great. And again, I really appreciate the chance to talk about probably one of the most significant strategic challenges facing the United States, but also many of our allies and partners. China effectively controls the terms of trade through a network of strategically positioned ports, either owned outright or operated by Chinese Communist Party, but also the largest shipbuilder and shipping enterprises in the world right now. So they control the terms of trade. And for the United States, with less than 80 ships flagged and crewed by American citizens, we are reliant, unfortunately, on those countries that are not very friendly to us. And so the way this plays out is it would feel like a sanction, or it would feel like a delay of goods coming to the United States and store shelves going bare. Or if you are a company and you need parts for whatever you're producing in the United States, but you rely on components from China, they may not show up in time to keep your factories functioning. So there's a very direct effect. It can either come very quietly and covertly to make perhaps a political message from the Chinese Communist Party, or it could be extremely and very explicitly preventing ships to dock in ports, to take on cargo, or ships coming to the United States, period.
I want to draw on something that you just said. You said there are fewer than 80 U.S. flagged ships. Can you build that out a little bit and explain a little bit to our audience what you mean? So
when you have a flagship, that gives the government some control in taxing and regulatory control over it. When you have a crew that's from your country, now you have people that are loyal to your country or that you have the authority over. So when you have a ship that doesn't have either of those, you have very little authority and certainly no control. The ownership, of course, also plays into this as well. Right now, the United States, if it got itself into a war or a crisis, and it only had ships that it could rely on, you're looking at 80 that are involved in international trade. It has a lot more ships, but they go up and down the Mississippi river system, intercoastal highway. They should not count when it comes into geopolitical kind of pressure campaigns or war that the country could find itself in. And that's less than 80, and it's rapidly going down.
That surprises me. I didn't realize it was so few. Mr. Sanyal, I'd like to come to you to sort of build on Brent's answer, especially how you see from where you're sitting on how China is enhancing its military capabilities through maritime industry control. What do you think this means for global security, and how are you looking at this specifically from your perch here in Delhi, in India?
So we have a very similar problem as the US. Something like over 90% of our merchandise trade is done on ships which we, like the US, have little to no control over. We are actually slightly better positioned than the US because we have about 480 such ships. But the fact of the matter is that's nothing compared to what is needed. The bigger problem is that this is not just the current situation that is bad. The pipeline is just as bad, if not worse. So over 50% of all the ships being currently built in the world is actually being built in China. And then if you include Korea and Japan, you end up with some 95% odd percent of all the ships being built on the planet are built in that tiny space in the East Asia. India builds about some 0.5% of the world's ships. Now that's ridiculous because we have every ingredient needed to be a real serious shipbuilding country. We have the coastline, we have the technology, we build nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. I'm sure we can build oil tankers. We have young population. Remember, shipbuilding is all about young men taking plates of steel and welding them together. This is a real millions of hours of welding. That's what shipbuilding really is.
Yeah, down to brass tacks.
Yeah. So this is basically an industry that is made for us. We have the steel, the young men, the needed for it, the coastline, and the domestic demand for these ships. And for a number of reasons, we hadn't paid enough attention to it. There's a certain amount of capital expenditure, some government support that we needed to give it. Very recently, we have begun to pay attention to this. And it's interesting to see that our friends in the US have also noticed the same problem and came to very similar conclusions.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but you said India has 450.
480.
480. America has 80.
80.
Yeah. What about China? What does China have? How does China control this?
So China's, always include Hong Kong. And so if you look in like the UN track records, they break out the People's Republic of China and they have Hong Kong separate, but you should always put the two together. And on some metrics of like tonnage, number of ships greater than 1,000 tons, you're looking at over 6,000 ships. That's the number one in the world.
Okay, by far it seems.
And the containers. So it's not just ship. If you take the containers, they have a very high proportion of that as well.
And have we seen China exert its economic influence through maritime control up until this point? Like, is that something that maybe India or maybe the U.S. has experienced firsthand and has experienced the potential economic implications of this? Maybe, Mr. Sanyal, I'll start with you.
So you do see it in a soft sort of way because when there are, for example, container shortages, you'll be pushed down the preference list if you happen to be an exporter who's competing with a Chinese company or something like that. Those kinds of things have happened. We saw that, for example, during the spike up just after COVID. And so on. So we have had that. Nothing serious yet.
Okay.
But I don't advocate waiting till it becomes that bad. The situation is such that we really need to rebuild our fleets. We used to have a problem with India not having great ports, but now our ports are decent. We are building a massive new port just north of Mumbai called Vadhavan, which will be bigger than all our current ports put together. So the ports part of shipping we are fixing. There are other bits of the shipping thing we are also fixing. But the bit that we haven't fixed is the business of actually physically building ships and owning these ships. So we're not just shipbuilding, but also fixing flagging, ownership, all these kinds of things, so that these ships don't end up in flags of convenience of various kinds where we have no control over them. So recently, for example, we've created a maritime fund. We're just in the process of creating it. We have made ships, large ships, as infrastructure, which allows our banks to give them very long loans.
Okay.
There are 4 laws currently in Parliament which change some of these ownership flagging type stuff. We'll change a few more. So the point is we are paying a great deal of attention to this. We are very pleased to see that America too is doing that, and I can talk about it later. I have some ideas about how maybe we should collaborate on this issue.
I want to get to that. So, Brent, I want to turn to you first. And if possible, can you talk a little bit about how the new administration in the United States, how the Trump administration is approaching this issue, how it's moving to counter China's maritime dominance? I mentioned the shipbuilding office in the White House. There's that. What else? What does that look like?
Well, if you go back about a year, there was the Ships for America Act.
Okay.
And so while India may have 4 laws, we've kind of taken and worked on pulling into a comprehensive approach. It's what works for the United States in our circumstances. And so there's 4 elements of it. So there's this law.
Okay.
You have in the NSC, the National Security Council, you have a maritime office, and I believe this is what President Trump was referring to. But there still is this congressional job or position of a maritime czar. And it'll probably sit somewhere in between, co-equal to the National Security Advisor that heads the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. Because in shipping, there is a geostrategic aspect. There's a security and there's an economic piece to this. And so there's still more coming. There's also been a lot of talk about executive orders, and it appears that that will lead the legislation that will come probably in the next month or two, the Ships for America Act.
Okay. And then, Mr. Sanyal, to you, you mentioned earlier that you had some ideas on maybe how the U.S. and India should be collaborating on these issues.
So in fact, this is not only an issue just for U.S. and India, it's actually a problem for the Quad. The Australians need ships. But they have literally no way of building it. They don't have the ecosystem, they don't have the people, they don't have the steel, and they don't even have the size of a country to get serious shipbuilding going. The Japanese, ironically, do have a shipbuilding industry, so they have the ecosystem, but it is rapidly dying out. In fact, that is where the Chinese got all their new orders from, by basically grabbing it away from the Japanese. And their problem is, of course, they don't have the young men needed to do all the welding, which is basically, as I said, the biggest problem with. And the Koreans, too, will shortly have the same problem. Their demographics is even worse than Japan's. So the thing is, so for the Quad, this is an issue. So now, the good news is, the four of us, however, together have all the pieces. We have, as I said, we want to do this anyway. We have some of the technology, we have the steel, we have the men, but there are certain areas, for example, high quality engines. I mean, clearly the Japanese and maybe the Americans have much better quality engines. There are now green engines that are coming on stream. So for example, there are certain areas where we could maybe just build the hulls, hand it to the Americans to kit it out in various ways, or the Japanese can put in the software. I don't know. And the point I'm making is that this is something the Quad could do very well together. It serves a geopolitical purpose, but very importantly, between us we have all the pieces. So this is, as I said, something the Quad could attempt to create a serious shipbuilding sort of ecosystem. For example, the US, if it attempted to just do it alone, maybe for certain kinds of ships, maybe the Navy ships, etc., it would be able to do, but very quickly it would become prohibitively expensive in many areas to do it in the U.S.
If I can add this, so please. The Quad is a natural fit.
Yeah.
There's got to be more also about how we coordinate or normalize our regulatory environments across this, but also to attract capital investment. For the United States, this is one of the main things and one of the big outcomes of positively talking about growing the American maritime industrial sector again. And you see this with South Korean entities like Hanwha investing and buying the Philadelphia shipyard, which has a backlog of shipbuilding, and that's gold if you're trying to get into the shipbuilding business, is to get a port that has that. But I would go further and say that we need, like taking a lesson from the G7, that we need to also look at having an informal group of like-minded countries, a maritime group of nations, to try to work out our regulatory environments, our investment environments, so that we can actually find a way that we assure a growth in this critical maritime industrial sector. But it's more than just shipbuilding, it's also the shipping. And so there's a lot of room there, and I think a maritime group of nations is one way to get to it.
Yes, in fact, it's not just about the physical building. I mean, there is the insurance, there is the finance, there is the logistics of it. So there's many, many things that will have to be coordinated, but I don't see any reason we shouldn't do this. Because as I said, all the pieces, somebody in this group has these pieces.
Yeah.
We could bring in the Europeans into this as well. Yes. Yes, I think this is an obvious area where we should collaborate.
Is this something China would push back on?
Yes. In fact, in some ways, they already have.
Okay.
So about a year and a half ago, some of the ideas, and for the United States, we have to find out what is America's comparative advantage. What does an American maritime industrial revival provide as a net good to other like-minded nations, to say the Quad or a larger group of nations? And one of it was small modular nuclear reactors as a means of propulsion, meets environmental standards, zero carbon, but it also provides you what's called fast steaming. So you need less ships to move as much cargo. The Chinese have also started to try to make it seem like that they have a better cost proposition as a way to try to curtail that capital movement to, say, the United States, to bring these things forward. But I think the geostrategic realities, I think, are pretty much nullifying that.
Okay. Sir, final word to you. You said this was a natural fit, perhaps, for the Quad. These countries together, they have the steel, they have the men,
they have the finance.
They have the finance. Do they have the trust between each other
So
to really make progress?
We have to build it.
Okay.
This is exactly what you have to build. I mean, that's why it hasn't happened. But then, in some ways, as I said, conversations like at Raisina are where these kinds of ideas get floated. I personally think it's a great idea to put all these pieces together and see where it goes.
Excellent. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you so much.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Brent Sadler, thank you so much. This is an excellent conversation, gave us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.